Okay, next video, gonna try and get this one done quickly. Let's jump right in. So, this topic is evolution of populations. Specifically, big focus is going to be on the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which I'll get to in a second. So, key idea guiding this section is that genetic variation is what makes evolution happen. It's the raw material that evolution can act on. You need variation to already be in the population in order for that population to be able to evolve and adapt to its environment. And this variation can be from the genetic code itself to how much of a gene they actually express. Thinking like our sticklebacks with the spines and no spines based on where they expressed that one gene. But it's important to remember that when we talk about phenotype, we're really talking about your genetics, your genotype, but also how the environment influences the expression. So, again, thinking of like the hares in the winter have a different color of fur than hares in the summer. So, where does this genetic variation come from in the first place? Two main sources. Both are unreliable for short term. So they are mutation and gene duplication. Mutation is fairly straightforward. Some mutation happens, but it does have to happen in the gametes in the sperm and egg producing cells in order to be passed on to the offspring. It could be a point mutation, or it could be a larger deletion insertion type of mutation. The other form is from gene duplication, which we talked about a little bit last unit. You can essentially copy and duplicate whole regions of a chromosome. Often we'll duplicate a gene so that we have something to mutate while still having a good copy of the gene in reserve. The other big source, it's not really a source as much as a process that takes the most advantage of the variation that we have, is sexual reproduction. Because mutation is really not a reliable source of variation, especially for larger, more complex organisms, such as plants and animals. Viruses have a very high mutation rate, so that's how they largely get their variation, but we rely on sexual reproduction to shuffle the existing alleles around. Crossing over shuffles it even more. And it's way more important than mutation is to actually get us the genetic differences that we see. There's already plenty of combinations and possibilities and versions of genes out there. It's easier to just shuffle them up rather than evolve a whole new thing. Okay, so we are going to be talking largely using the terms gene pool and population here. So when I talk about a population, I am talking about the actual group of individuals in a local area. And we are using the biological species concept, which means that they are all individuals that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So they can have kids and their kids can have kids. When I reference the gene pool, I'm really talking about the actual genetic material there. Usually for just one specific gene, one specific locus. But the gene pool will just be all of the alleles for all of the loci in a population. It's essentially just how many traits are there and how many of each trait is there. So it kind of starts to care about the frequency of traits. And as a side note, when I say locus or loci, which is just the plural of locus, we're just talking about where on a chromosome the gene actually is. So if I say all the alleles for a single loci, that's just all the different alleles for a specific gene. If I say all the alleles for all loci, that's every possible allele at every possible position. Finally, we get to Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. We will work on this in class a lot. I'm gonna try and not spend too much time talking about the math parts here. There are two equations that are both on the equation sheet, but in general, what a Hardy-Weinberg principle states is that if there is no evolution occurring, then the frequencies of alleles and genotypes in a population should remain constant. A big example for this is human biological sex, where there is no evolutionary pressure to have a boy or a girl, and so the frequency of boy versus girl remains 50-50. But it is a highly theoretical principle. In the real world, 99% of the time, the allele frequencies are changing, genotype frequencies are changing, things are changing. So it's more of a tool that we use, but we understand that it doesn't necessarily predict what is happening in the future. It's kind of giving us a statistical snapshot of where we are at a point in time. Another thing is that when we're talking about Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, we are talking usually about specific traits, because not all traits will be under natural selection. I brought up the male-female thing in humans as an example. Some traits can be under pressure and thus be not in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, while others are when they are lacking that selective pressure. Okay, moving on. I will talk more about these equations actually in class. There are 5 conditions for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium that all basically add up to no evolution happens. So the first is that there are no mutations occurring, so 0 mutations in the population, obviously not true. The second is random mating, so there's no sexual selection, just males and females randomly pair up. Third, no natural selection, so the environment itself is not putting any selection pressure on whatever trait you're looking at. So the environment isn't, other members of the species aren't. You also have a very large population size. This is to eliminate any effects of random chance. If you have a very small population, random chance plays a much bigger role than if you have a population of millions. And then lastly, there is no gene flow, aka no migration in or out of the population. So everything that's born there dies there, nobody moves in. If all 5 of those are met, then the population can be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium for that trait. They're pretty much never all met, but we pretend. So, talking about allele frequencies, because allele frequencies are what the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium uses. That's what it looks at. And it's really, Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is something that will tie into chi-square analysis to say if a population is evolving or not. So because it's so theoretical, it's something that we can disprove using a chi-square analysis in order to make a claim. What are those claims that we're trying to make are often one of these few. You could be trying to make the natural selection claim. That one's fairly obvious, that different things have different abilities to survive and reproduce and have more kids. The more kids you have, the more you contribute your particular alleles to the population. If you have a better chance at survival, your alleles will start to become more common over time as you had more kids than people who didn't. But there's 2 other things that can happen. The first is genetic drift. So this is just how our alleles frequencies change from a generation to the next just due to random chance. This is a negative towards variation, and typically is a bigger issue the smaller your population is. If you only have 10 individuals, it is possible that if they all have one set of kids, that all the kids are the same gender. So it's basically like genetics ultimately comes down to like flipping a coin of which allele you get. Genetic drift is saying, well, what if random chance says I flip the coin and get 5 heads in a row? That can happen. If I flip a coin 5 million times and get 5 million heads in a row, that's much less likely. So genetic drift is just how the allele frequencies, how the traits change over time just due to random chance. And then you have gene flow. This is movement of alleles either into or out of the population. This is migration. It couldn't be good or bad. Invasive species tend to be bad. Sometimes movement of alleles out of the population might be beneficial for the population as a whole. Some other effects that can play a role in all of this are are what's called the founder effect and the bottleneck effect. So the founder effect is when you have a few individuals that found a new population. Think the Galapagos finches. They started on the mainland. A few of them migrate, make it over to the islands, and then start to reproduce. The idea is that because this migration is happening randomly, that the population in the new location could look very different from what the population started as. In the example here, we see that the population migrates. It starts off as largely red, but over time it becomes nearly blue, even though the original population is a 50-50 mix. So essentially, when you split off from the group and start reproducing, you might start to look different after a bit of time. Then we have the bottleneck effect, and this is you suddenly reduce the population size, so a ton of the individuals die off for some reason, but it is a random reason. There's no fitness thing that gave them a better chance to survive. It is just some huge change, some huge disaster. And this means, because everyone died randomly, that the new population may not look like what you initially had. If you have 80% of your population is black and 20% is white fur, and then some random event happens that just kills off 50% of everyone, it doesn't necessarily take from the two fur colors equally. It could, in fact, just randomly, due to chance, kill off one fur color more than the other and cause the allele frequencies to shift and the new population to look different than they used to. But it is important to note that only natural selection causes adaptive evolution. So genetic drift, gene flow, founder effect, bottleneck effect, those are all causing some sort of evolution, some sort of change in allele frequencies of a population, but it is not adaptive. It does not make them better fit and better suited to their environment. Only natural selection can do that. And when it does, there are three different ways we characterize this. The first is directional selection, where it basically pushes everyone to one end of a phenotypic range. So if we're looking at fur color of mice, it pushes everybody from the middle, light brown color, all the way to the dark color mice. Disruptive selection is favoring anyone that's at either extreme. So it just takes out everyone from the middle ground. You can't be light brown. You're either very light or very dark color fur. Either one of the two is favored as long as you're at one of the extremes. And then stabilizing selection is really just the opposite. It's like squeezing the whole gene pool up into the average. Basically saying, again, with the fur color, it's better for everyone to be the same light color brown mouse. And so it pushes everyone in and it moves against the extremes. It just depends on the situation you're in. All of this depends on the relative fitness or the ability or contribution of an individual that they make to the gene pool relative to other individuals. If a light color mouse has 20 kids and a dark color mouse only has 2, then we may expect the allele frequencies to start to favor light colored mice in the future. But it does not have to be direct competition. It could just be that the light mice get eaten less than the darker colored mice. It could be they're better able to find food or they need less of a nutrient, but just doesn't have to be direct competition. They may not interact directly at all. Continuing, natural selection is increasing frequencies of alleles that help us survive and reproduce, so like getting food, hiding from predators, things like that. And it's to match what your environment is. Again, gene flow, genetic drift do not lead to this adaptive evolution. They may actually make you less adapted to your environment. The current situation with polar bears is kind of an example. They're not adapting to their environment. It's more of a bottlenecking effect where some of them are just randomly dying because of loss of habitat. And so they are becoming less fit for their environment. We haven't discussed this too much. We'll talk about it more in the next lecture. Sexual selection is also natural selection just for mating success. So it doesn't make you more suited to your environment. It just makes you more suited to find a mate. So it might mean you have a great mating dance or a great bird song, but it doesn't necessarily make it better for you to survive, just better to have kids. But this can result in sexual dimorphism, where males and females look quite different from each other. There are some cool examples of it. that I will hopefully remember to talk about in class. Finally, there's often a misconception of natural selection and fashioning this perfect organism or having an end goal of something being more evolved than something else, but that is not true. Selection and natural selection only acts, on existing variation within the population. So it's not creating anything completely new. It's just taking the best of what's already there. But it's also limited. It's limited by what it has. Humans have never had wings, and our ancestors have never had wings. We cannot just one day evolve wings. We can only work with what we're given. Bats were able to do it by modifying their forelimbs and their arms. But we are limited by the fact that we need our arms for other things. We can't just randomly evolve new limbs. Second or third, there are also compromises. Being better at something might make you worse at another thing. If you're dark colored to blend in the night and hide amongst the darkness, you might stand out more during the day. And so you might have to sleep more at night. Humans have evolved to not produce our own, I think it's vitamin B12. There's certain vitamins that we can only get from our diet. At one point, we adapted to not need it, but it was a compromise that we now have to consume it. Ultimately, it is just this weird interaction between chance, natural selection, and whatever environmental changes are happening, interacting to create an organism that is good enough to survive. It's not the perfect organism for survival. If you were intentional behind it, you could probably come up with a better solution. But it's a good enough solution to succeed, good enough to outcompete everyone else that was there. We'll watch this video in class. It's kind of fun. Human eye is not designed well. That is this lecture. Let's see how long it was. I think it was a little too long. 17 minutes, not bad. I'm going to stop recording soon. That's all, folks. Look up male versus female anglerfish if you want a cool example of sexual dimorphism.